The 60 floating cages Frank Mercer had tended for 2 years were kindling by dawn.
2 years of salinity trials, gone in one night. Coast Guard. This is Frank Mercer at Grid 47. Someone just bulldozed my entire oyster farm. I need officers here now.
But the attack hadn't come out of nowhere. The waterfront HOA had been circling for months. Amy Caldwell, the HOA chair, had made her position clear at the last meeting.
Those floating cages ruin every homeowner's view. The regatta requires clean sightlines. Get rid of them, or I will.
He had recorded the threat, but he never imagined she'd actually do something this destructive.
The cages had survived hurricanes. They weren't built for pure spite. The Coast Guard was on its way. Frank looked out at the ruined grid and knew this wasn't vandalism. It was an act of war. The war hadn't been declared that morning. It had been building for weeks in bright-lit community rooms.
These floating cages are an eyesore, a blight on our property values, and a navigational hazard for the regatta.
This isn't just my livelihood, ma'am. It's a federally permitted aquaculture operation. You can't just wish it away.
Permits can be challenged. Public opinion isn't on your side, Mercer. This is a community decision.
These people don't understand what's at stake. My grandfather's blood is in that water.
Frank walked out into the parking lot, the salt air suddenly feeling heavier than it had in years. At home, he sat in the dim light of his living room, holding the only photograph that ever mattered.
You said the water remembers everything, Pop. What would you tell these people?
The photograph showed a younger man in oilskins, holding the first oyster cage from 1958. Frank pressed his thumb to the glass. He would not be the generation that let go. While Frank held his grandfather's photograph, Amy Caldwell was making other plans.
I need a workboat for a private project, something with a diesel engine and a reinforced bow. This one looks like it could plow through a submerged log. Perfect for my needs.
She used a false name and address on the rental form, then paid entirely in cash.
No credit card, no deposit slip. Just another anonymous customer at a marina that doesn't ask questions. What time does the gate lock at night? I might need to be out on the water after dark. After 9, this entire inlet turns into a blind spot. No patrols, no witnesses.
She climbed into her SUV and stared across the bay at Frank's floating cages.
Those cages have been an eyesore long enough. The regatta deserves a clear course.
Amy Caldwell had just set a trap, whose teeth she did not yet see. The law was already writing her future. By 11 that night, Amy Caldwell stepped onto the rented workboat with no running lights and a tank full of diesel.
This is it. By sunrise, every last cage will be driftwood.
The oyster grid materialized out of the dark like a low, silent promise. 60 cages, 60 obstacles, 60 reasons for the regatta to be perfect.
Hold the throttle steady. They're just bubbles in the water.
The diesel engine roared as the bow ripped into the first cage, splitting cedar and polypropylene like wet cardboard.
Back it up. Hit that cluster again. Don't leave a single float attached.
She made 3 passes across the grid. By 3 a.m., not a single cage held its shape. The bay looked like a bomb site. Frank Mercer walked the dock at first light and found his legacy in pieces.
2 years of data, of breeding, of my grandfather's water. Someone did this on purpose.
The Coast Guard cutter surfed the inbound tide, and the investigation that would reach all the way to federal court had just begun. A Coast Guard officer stepped onto the dock with a digital camera and the kind of stillness that meant bad news. He told Frank the damage pattern was deliberate. 3 parallel runs right through the center of the grid.
Deliberate. That word confirmed what my gut already knew.
Then the officer mentioned something Frank had never heard before. The entire estuary was a NOAA-monitored aquaculture zone, tracked by satellite AIS, every vessel's position logged.
Satellite tracking? You are saying every boat that comes through here leaves a digital wake?
The officer nodded. AIS. Automatic Identification System. Continuously broadcasts vessel positions to NOAA's enforcement satellite network, day and night.
That data could tell us exactly which boat turned my cages into splinters, and whose hands were on the wheel.
He radioed the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement while Frank stood there, debris still lapping against the dock, the weight of the morning pressing into his chest.
When will they get here?
Within the hour, the officer said, and they'll bring the tracking data with them. Someone is going to have a very bad day. Agent Price stepped onto the dock, tablet in hand, scanning the debris with a practiced eye.
Mr. Mercer, the AIS log has a vessel entering your Oyster zone at 11:30 last night. 3 deliberate passes.
3 passes. Whoever did this wanted to be sure nothing survived.
The tablet displayed the vessel's track, a red line slicing through the grid, back and forth, recorded by satellite.
This AIS ID belongs to a rental fleet at Bayshore Marina. Your vandal came from 3 miles up the coast.
Bayshore Marina. That's a small operation. They keep records. We can find who rented it.
That's where we're headed. I've got a Coast Guard boat standing by. We leave in 5.
Finally, a direction. Someone's name is about to land on a very official piece of paper.
Frank climbed aboard the NOAA vessel, the tablet still glowing between them, the evidence undeniable.
And for the first time since dawn, I felt something other than grief. I felt close.
At Bayshore Marina, the rental office was a cramped pine panel room, reeking of diesel and old bait. The owner recognized the NOAA badge before Agent Price said a word.
We need to trace a boat you rented yesterday. Hull 338 Bay. Pull the paperwork, please.
The owner's hands were steady, but his eyes flicked to the door. He slid a binder across the counter. The rental contract listed a name, a driver's license number, and a timestamp, 4:07 p.m., the day before the destruction. The name, Amy Caldwell.
Amy Caldwell, the voice that had said, "Get rid of them, or I will," had just turned into ink on federal evidence.
This matches her HOA directory address, 12 Shoreline Drive, We've got her cold.
Cold was the right word. She'd acted in the dark, but AIS had lit up her every move.
I am calling this in. A federal warrant will be ready by tonight. Until then, we say nothing.
Frank stared at the signed slip. The woman who championed sightlines and regattas had just guaranteed herself a different view. The inside of a courtroom. Agent Price folded the evidence into his jacket and headed for the door. The trap was set, and Amy Caldwell still thought she'd won. Amy Caldwell was at her waterfront home when the first rumor reached her.
Someone tipped me off. NOAA came to Bayshore Marina asking about a rental. Is that connected to Frank Mercer's cages? They can't have a paper trail. I paid cash. I didn't give my real name.
She called her lawyer within the hour, her voice measured but brittle.
I need to know if NOAA can link that boat to me. What are my exposure if they prove something?
The HOA board met that evening under the guise of a routine review, but the agenda had only one item.
We have to stand together. If Mercer is allowed to claim damages from any of us, our whole community could be liable.
A faction nodded, but others stared at their hands. The fracture was already visible. Meanwhile, Frank sat in Agent Price's makeshift office and turned his phone around. The screen glowed with a message from an unknown number. Drop the case or you'll lose more than oysters. The next morning, a NOAA scientist contacted Frank with a request that sounded more like a summons.
Dr. Elaine Park from the Climate Fisheries Lab. She sounded like she hadn't slept, said it was about my oysters.
At the lab, she spread a thick federal file across the table and pointed to a cover page Frank had never seen. Project 4473, Salinity Adaptive Oyster Resilience, Trial. Lead cultivation site, Mercer Oyster Farm. Federal grant value, $2.1 million.
$2 million. I was the designated grow site for a climate experiment and never even knew it.
The scientist explained that NOAA had been monitoring his cages remotely for 2 years. Every oyster was a genetic archive.
You are telling me that breeding stock represented 5 years of genetic selection for low salinity survival.
She nodded. The destruction hadn't just killed shellfish. It had deleted a living climate archive that couldn't be replicated for years.
This wasn't property damage anymore. It was obstruction of climate research. The charges were about to get federal in a way Amy couldn't imagine.
Back at the dock, Frank looked at the shattered cages and felt something shift. The law wasn't just on his side. It was already rewriting the charges. Amy's lawyer didn't sugarcoat the federal penalty. Destruction of federally permitted aquaculture carried a maximum of 10 years in prison.
Frank, this has gone far enough. I am willing to make this go away. $100,000, cash, and you walk away.
100,000. She thinks I'll trade 2 years of genetic data and a $2.1 million federal grant. The grant on my oysters is $2.1 million, Amy. Your offer is an insult, and this entire call is being recorded.
He's recording. He's going to hand this directly to Price. I just made everything worse.
Frank walked straight to Agent Price's office and hit play on the recording without a word.
Attempted bribery of a victim in a federal case. She just added a whole new set of charges.
The HOA posted an emergency meeting notice by noon. The recall of Chair Caldwell was now official business.
After everything I did for this community, they're voting to throw me out like garbage.
Price told Frank the prosecutor was adding obstruction of climate research. Amy wasn't just a vandal anymore. She was about to become a federal test case. The federal prosecutor's office released the indictment at noon. Charges: Lacey Act, Magnuson-Stevens Act, and obstruction of climate research. Maximum combined penalty: 20 years federal imprisonment.
20 years, Frank. Add the bribery attempt, and she's facing a cell for the rest of her productive life.
20 years for my oysters. She did this for sightlines and regattas. Now her whole world is about to collapse.
Amy's lawyer called her within the hour. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just listened like a trapped animal.
They're going to make an example out of me. I'll be the woman who killed climate oysters for a party.
The HOA sent an email blast. The annual regatta was canceled due to pending legal issues.
Tell the prosecutor, I'll cooperate fully. I'll write a victim statement, whatever they need.
The prosecutor wants a victim impact statement by Friday. This case is going to set a national precedent.
The case was set for a federal trial, and for the first time, Amy Caldwell's name was spoken in the same sentence as climate obstruction. That evening, the community center split down the middle. Neighbors who'd called Frank a crank now calling him a cause. A woman in white denim jabbed a finger at Frank's chest, her voice trembling with fury.
I didn't ruin your regatta. Amy Caldwell did that when she took a rented boat to my federally protected oyster beds. They still can't see it. They'd rather blame the victim than admit their HOA chair committed a federal crime.
The HOA board called a vote. 4-1. Amy Caldwell was no longer chair.
They'll regret this. When I beat these charges, I'll sue every board member for defamation.
Then came a call from the Coastal Resilience Institute, offering to fund the entire rebuild and name a research grant after his grandfather.
A grant named after Pop. He'd have liked that. The water wasn't done with us yet.
On the community page, Amy posted, "Don't believe the lies. Frank Mercer is using climate hysteria to steal our marina."
She can post whatever she wants. The truth is already on a federal docket.
By breakfast, the courthouse parking lot was a solid wall of broadcast trucks.
This isn't about revenge. People need to understand what was lost. A decade of climate genetics that can't be replaced.
At 12 Shoreline Drive, every shade was drawn. Amy Caldwell watched from a second-story window, unseen.
They're calling me a climate criminal. I was protecting property values for the whole neighborhood.
Online, the clip of Frank's voice saying, "Salinity adaptive oysters," had been shared 40,000 times. A petition titled, "Justice for Mercer Oyster Farm," had gathered 50,000 signatures in 8 hours. Aerial footage of the shattered cage grid made the evening cycle on 3 national networks.
I never wanted a spotlight, but if this makes people care about the water, then maybe Pop would approve. Tell Amy Caldwell I am not her enemy. The law is, and the law was watching the whole time.
The court set a trial date for the first week of March, and Frank's victim statement was already on the judge's desk the night before his deposition. Frank sat alone with the photograph that had seen 2 wars and 1,000 tides.
You told me the water remembers. I have to make sure the law remembers too. No mercy for someone who kills a future.
He wrote the victim impact statement by hand, every word a record of what had been erased.
This isn't revenge. It's protection. If she walks away, every waterfront developer in the country will think they can bulldoze a federal project. No deals, no settlement. I am asking for the maximum. My oysters were more than food. They were a defense against a changing ocean.
The prosecutor nodded and added the statement to a file that already weighed 12 pounds. At the status conference, the judge held up the indictment and read the obstruction charge aloud for the record.
Obstruction of climate research. They're going to bury me under a charge no jury will even understand.
Outside, Frank spoke to the cameras one last time before the gag order locked everything down.
This trial isn't about me. It's about whether we're allowed to protect the water we all depend on. I'll see you in March.
At dusk, 3 NOAA vehicles and a Coast Guard SUV pulled into the horseshoe driveway of 12 Shoreline Drive.
They're here, right on time, like it's some kind of performance. Don't let them see my hands shake.
Amy Caldwell, you are under arrest for violation of the Lacey Act, Magnuson-Stevens Act, and obstruction of climate research.
Obstruction of climate research. They're actually going to say those words on camera.
She didn't scream. She didn't resist. She just extended her wrists, the magenta windbreaker catching the last light.
Every neighbor with a phone. This is going straight to the community page, the one I used to control.
A neighbor's live stream captured the whole thing, the link spreading faster than any regatta cancellation. Price ducked her into the back of the Crown Vic, and the convoy pulled away, leaving only the mailbox and 1,000 online witnesses. By 9 o'clock, Amy Caldwell was processed and placed in a federal holding cell. Her bail hearing was scheduled for 10 tomorrow.
I committed a federal crime for a party that never even happened.
The morning after Amy's arrest, the HOA board passed a single motion: cancel the marina lease with the county. The notice read, effective immediately. The marina lease for Shoreline Drive is revoked by county order.
The gate came down by afternoon. The regatta's dead. The marina's locked. Now, maybe the water can heal.
NOAA released emergency grant funds within the week. Volunteers arrived with waders and mesh, the sound of hammers on cedar filling the estuary.
Pop would have called this a better reason to get wet than any regatta.
The first new cage went into the water on a clear March morning, its cedar frame bright against the gray.
This isn't just a cage. It's a promise to the future, and we're going to keep it.
The NOAA grant came with a condition. Frank would host student researchers to continue the salinity trials his grandfather started.
Tell Price we'll have new data by fall. The water remembers every salt grain, and so do we.
The rebuilt grid wasn't just a target for one woman's spite. It was now a symbol, guarded by federal law, watched by satellites, and owned by a man who never stopped believing the water would forgive. March carried the trial into a high-vaulted federal courtroom, where the air smelled of old paper and ozone. Frank spoke of his grandfather's first cage in 1958, and the 60 cages that had held 2 years of genetic data.
Those oysters weren't just seafood. They were a living record of how a species can adapt to a changing ocean.
The prosecutor laid the AIS track across a screen larger than a car windshield.
The defendant signed for hull 338B at 4:07 p.m., the day before the destruction. Her driver's license is on file.
Amy's attorney rose, but every question only allowed Frank to say salinity, adaptive one more time.
I watched the jury's faces and felt my entire defense collapse into a single word: irreversible.
I am not asking for revenge. I am asking you to protect the next cage from the next person who thinks it's ugly.
The judge charged the jury and sent them to deliberate. The courtroom fell into a humming silence.
Whatever the verdict, the water would remember. And so would I.
The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. When the bailiff called them back, the gallery rose like a caught wave. The foreperson unfolded a single sheet of paper and read the first charge aloud. On the count of obstruction of climate research, we find the defendant, Amy Caldwell, guilty. He continued through the Lacey Act and Magnuson-Stevens Act, the word guilty, landing each time like a stone in still water. Amy Caldwell dropped her head, her shoulders jerking with sobs that had nowhere else to go.
It's over. All for sightlines. They'll put me away for years.
Frank didn't smile. He closed his eyes, breathed once, then opened them to the sound of his grandfather's voice in his head.
The water remembers. And now the law does too.
The judge thanked the jury and ordered sentencing for the following month. Outside the courtroom, Agent Price nodded to Frank, the satellite track still glowing on his tablet. The coordinates had led exactly here. 1 month later, the same courtroom filled again. This time the silence was heavier. The judge spoke directly into the record about climate obstruction, calling it a crime against the future, not just a permit violation. Amy Caldwell is sentenced to 60 months federal prison, a $150,000 fine, and full restitution for the destroyed oyster cages.
60 months. For sightlines. I am going to prison for a regatta that never happened.
Deputies handcuffed her again, and this time the magenta windbreaker was street clothes. Faded, ordinary, final.
It's done. The water can breathe, and so can I. Justice isn't always for the living. Sometimes it's for the ones who aren't here to ask.
The morning edition carried the headline, HOA Chair Guilty of Federal Climate Obstruction. Below the fold, a smaller subhead read, Satellite Tracking Traced Rental Boat to Her Driveway. Frank walked down the courthouse steps, past the chained marina gate, toward the rebuilt cages. The water had the last word. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Frank's daughter stood apart from the reporters, waiting like she'd waited for 23 years.
You didn't have to fly all the way out here.
For a moment, he wasn't the oyster farmer or the federal witness. He was just a father whose daughter had come to say she was proud.
This was never about revenge. It's about responsibility to the water, to the climate, and to my grandfather's memory.
Reporters snapped a final photograph as Frank slipped his grandfather's picture from his jacket and held it up for the last time.
This man taught me that the water remembers. And now, I hope, the law will too.
The marina gate was still chained, but no one mentioned the regatta anymore. The community's obsession had finally shifted.
The cages are rebuilt. The data is back on track. And the water still tastes like the bay my grandfather loved.
Frank turned toward home, toward the smell of brine and cedar, toward a future that felt, for the first time in months, like his own. As he walked away, the courthouse clock struck noon, and the chained marina gate caught the sunlight, a symbol of what had been lost and what had been protected. 1 year later, Frank Mercer stood behind a lectern in a coastal research center, the rebuilt grid visible through the window. The farm had posted its best survival rates in a decade. The salinity trials were informing hatcheries in 3 states. From his jacket, he withdrew the 1958 photograph and set it beside the microphone.
My grandfather's water is still my water. And as long as I am breathing, it will be protected.
He introduced the newest generation of oysters, small, resilient, carrying the genetics of the stock. Amy Caldwell had tried to destroy.
They're not just a crop. They're a line of defense for every estuary facing salt intrusion.
The applause lasted longer than he expected. It wasn't for him. He knew. It was for the lesson the water had taught. Afterward, NOAA scientists shook his hand. The same grant now extended for another 5 years.
Pop would have loved this part. not the speech. The science, the proof that the water does remember.
He slipped the photograph back into his pocket, wet with the morning's brine, and looked toward the bay. The tide was coming in again. The conference hall was already a memory. Frank stood on the dock that had seen ruin and rebirth, the sunset washing everything clean.
1 year since the trial, and every sunrise still feels like a gift I never expected.
He bent down and lifted a freshly grown oyster from the basket, the first of the new generation, marked for sampling. The shell fit his palm like 100 harvests before it, proof that the water had kept its promise. He worked the knife his grandfather had left him, and the shell gave way with a soft crack.
To the water, to pop, to a future worth defending.
He lifted the shell to the fading light and swallowed, tasting brine and renewal all at once. Around him, the floating cages stretched to the horizon. Each one a small federal promise. Each one a family he never thought he'd keep. Some things are worth protecting because they protect us all. The tide kept rising, and the grid held steady, as if the bay itself had learned to trust again.